The station called Vethkalos hung in the dark like a broken tooth, rusted, jagged, and cold against the dying glow of a red dwarf star, a place sitting so far out on the outer fringe that no law ever bothered to make the trip. It was the kind of place where ships docked quietly and left quickly, where cargo changed hands without questions, and where the strong simply took from the weak, because nobody was watching and nobody was coming. The Galactic Concorde's diplomatic envoy ship had been traveling through that stretch of dead space for 6 days when everything fell apart. There was no warning, no blinking alarm on the deck panels, no distress call, no time to think, just the sudden heavy crack of a boarding clamp locking onto the hull like a fist closing around something it had no intention of letting go. And then the sound of boots, heavy and clawed, marching through the ship's corridors with the easy confidence of things that had done this many times before. The Vrethkai had arrived. They were enormous, nearly 3 meters tall each, covered in dark green scales that layered over one another like plates of natural armor. Their eyes were yellow and cold, built for hunting in low and shifting light. Their claws were long enough to drag across metal walls just from walking and leave white scratch marks behind without even trying. They moved through the ship like they owned it, because in that moment they did. The Concorde crew was not a fighting force. They were diplomats, aides, translators, the non-technical staff, and the Vrethkai disarmed and herded every one of them into a tight group at the center of the main deck in less than 4 minutes, efficiently, almost boredly, the way a farmer rounds up chickens before a storm. Warlord Grathvel stood at the front of his boarding party, wider than 2 grown men standing side by side. His jaw lined with a ridge of forward-jutting bone that gave his face a permanent expression of contempt, and he looked over the captives the way a merchant looks over boxes of goods, weighing their value with cold yellow eyes. His gaze moved down the line of frightened faces and stopped Princess Saravel of the Ethan Sovereignty stood very still. She was young, barely past her first official diplomatic posting, then dressed in the pale silver-white uniform of her office, her 4-fingered hands pressed flat and tight against her thighs, her large amber eyes giving away nothing, even though inside she felt like a wire pulled too tight. She had trained for hostile situations. Every diplomat who traveled the fringe did. But no amount of training in a classroom made standing in front of Grathvel feel anything less than terrifying. Grathvel tilted his massive head and smiled, and on a Vrethkai face, that the smile was not a warm thing. It was a calculation wearing the shape of that one, he said to his soldiers, lifting one long claw in her direction. Has value. The sovereignty will pay a great deal for her safe return. Keep her comfortable. Then his yellow eyes slid sideways past her and landed on the human standing 2 positions to her left. The human was, by almost any standard, unremarkable medium height, short brown hair, dressed in the plain gray uniform of a Concord warrant officer with no decorations and nothing to distinguish him from any other face in any other corridor on any other ship. His hands were relaxed at his sides, and he was looking at the floor with a quiet, neutral expression. The way someone looks when they are waiting for something and they are in no hurry about it. His name on the manifest read, Warrant Officer Darren Cole. One of the Vrethkai soldiers walked up to Cole and examined him the way someone examines an unusual insect, turning Cole's arm over with 2 clawed fingers and staring at the bare skin with something between curiosity and disbelief. No scales, the soldier said, loudly enough for the others to hear. No armor plating, but no venom glands. Look at the claws, they are practically flat. This creature has no natural weapons at all. The other soldiers made that clicking sound deep in their throats, their version of laughter, and several of them leaned in to look, as if Cole were an exhibit in a museum of soft and defenseless things. Cole said nothing. He did not look up, did not tense, did not react in any visible way. He simply stood there, while they prodded and mocked him. On the way a stone sits in a river while water moves around it, Grathvel had already lost interest. He waved a heavy hand toward Cole without even looking at him fully and said, "Pit fights. Let the crew place bets. It will not survive long, but it will at least be entertaining." And just like that, the humans' fate was decided. The captives were sorted quickly. Princess Saravel and the other high-value prisoners were taken to the upper holding cells of Veth Kalos, and where conditions were at least functional, the remaining crew were divided between labor holds and the station's lower level. Cole was sent to the lower level. The pit on the lower level was a circular depression cut into the floor of a wide room, maybe 12 meters across, and with high rusted metal walls and a heavy-grated ceiling above where soldiers and station workers could crowd together and watch from above. It smelled of old blood and machine oil and something else that had soaked into the walls over years and could never quite be washed out. The first opponent they sent in with Cole was a Kreth, a species from the border systems. A four-armed and built low and dense like a barrel with legs, nearly 2 meters tall. It had been in the pit for 3 weeks and had not lost a single fight, and it had no interest in losing one now. The Vrethkai soldiers crowded the grate above, clicking and betting tokens against each other, the general agreement being that the human would last under 2 minutes. Cole stood at one end of the pit. The Kreth stood at the other. It rolled its 4 thick shoulders and began to pace, and Cole watched it, not nervously, not frantically. He just watched, steady and quiet, his eyes tracking the way the Kreth moved, the way it favored its left lower arm slightly, the way its right leg drove a little harder off the ground when it turned, the pattern of its breathing, the rhythm of its head when it scanned. He stood there and he watched and he did not move. The soldiers above went quiet, then started murmuring to each other in confusion, because this was not what prey did. Prey moved, ran, panicked, made noise. This creature was just standing there, looking at the Kreth like it was reading something written on it, and then Cole moved. Once. A single, clean, short movement that lasted no more than 2 seconds. The Kreth went down hard and did not get back up. The pit went completely silent. Cole stepped back to the wall and stood there, the same way he had been standing before, hands at his sides, weight even, expression blank. As if nothing had happened that was worth changing his posture over in the upper cells. Princess Saravel had watched through a narrow barred window. She had seen the whole thing from the moment Cole had stood still to the moment the Kreth hit the floor, and she felt something cold move through her chest that she could not immediately name. She had been preparing herself to watch the human die. She had felt guilty about it, had been telling herself there was nothing she could have done. And now she stood at the window with that cold feeling and no name for it. Uskra stood beside her, a Vrethkai defector who had been in the upper cells for weeks as a labor prisoner, old, scarred across the face, and very quiet. He had been watching, too. And his yellow eyes were narrowed in a way that had nothing to do with the dim light in the cell. "I have fought on many worlds," Uskra said, and his voice was low and careful, the way a voice gets when it is saying something near a thing it does not want to disturb. "And I have never seen prey stand still like that." Saravel said nothing. Below, Cole was already watching the gate, patient, unhurried, and still, waiting for whatever came next, the same way he had been waiting for everything since the moment they were taken. 3 days passed inside Veth Kalos, and in those 3 days Darren Cole did not try to escape. He did not ask questions of the guards, did not test the cell bars, did not whisper plans to the other prisoners at night. He simply existed in whatever space they put him in, quiet and still, and he watched. He watched the guards change shifts, noting exactly how long each rotation took, which guards walked fast and which ones walked slow, which ones talked to each other at the corridor junction and which ones stayed silent. He watched the way the light panels in the ceiling flickered on the east side of the holding block. and where the power was old and badly maintained. He watched the way one particular section of the wall near the ventilation shaft had a slightly different color from the rest, the kind of color that meant the metal behind the plating had weakened and separated. He watched everything, and he remembered everything, and he said nothing about any of it. Princess Saravel had been moved to a cell 2 doors down from the main prisoner group after her first day, close enough to speak through the bars, far enough that the guards thought of them as separate. She spent most of her time thinking about the report she was going to file when she got home, which was the only thing keeping her from thinking too hard about whether she was going to get home at all. On the morning of the 4th day, Cole spoke to her for the first time. He did not look at her when he did it. He was facing the far wall, which was a habit she had already noticed. He spoke low and without urgency. A corridor always stopped to argue at the corridor, always stopped to argue at the junction. They have done it every single night. And during those 4 minutes, the door lock on cell block 3 runs on backup power only, because the main line feeds through the east panel, which is also the panel that flickers. When backup power runs the lock, there is a 7-second window where the magnetic seal drops before the secondary catch engages. Saravel stared at him. "You have been watching for 3 days," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you did not tell anyone." "I was not ready," he said simply. "Now I am." That night, the escape moved exactly the way Cole said it would. The 7-second window opened when the east panel flickered. Cole was already at the lock with a piece of metal he had pulled from the inside edge of his cell cot 3 nights before. The door opened, and within 6 minutes he had moved through the cell block and opened 4 more doors, and the prisoner group was in the maintenance corridor behind the holding block, moving fast and low through the dark. There were 9 of them in total: Saravel, Cole, Uskra, the Vrethkai defector, 2 Concord crew members, a Lethian trade negotiator, and 3 others who had been on the station when the Vrethkai swept through it and simply had nowhere to go. They moved through maintenance shafts and power conduit corridors, Cole leading, never hesitating at a junction, always knowing which direction to go without stopping to think. And Saravel realized that he must have been building this map in his head over the past 3 days entirely from what he could hear and smell and feel from inside the cell block. The direction of air moving through vents, the sound patterns of feet above and below. All of it assembled quietly into something he could move through in the dark, as if he had walked it 100 times before Uskara moved close behind Saravel and said nothing. But she noticed that his eyes kept going to the back of Cole's head with that same narrowed, careful expression he had worn at the window on the first day. They were 4 corridors from the docking bay when Cole stopped. He held up one hand and the group froze behind him, and in the silence they heard it. Boots, more than one set, moving through the corridor ahead, not guards on a standard patrol. Too many of them, too fast. Too coordinated. A search party. Cole turned to the group and spoke quietly. "Commander Vethskar has activated a lockdown," he said, and he said it the way someone states a fact they confirmed before mentioning it. "There are 6 of them coming from the docking bay direction. They are Grath Vel's elite hunters. Vethskar sent the best ones." "How do you know there are 6? The Lethian trade negotiator whispered in a high, tight voice. "I counted the footsteps," Cole said. He looked at the group, and when he spoke again, his voice was the same low, flat tone it always was, the tone that had no fear in it and no excitement either, just information being passed from one place to another. "Keep going to the docking bay. The route is straight from here, 3rd left, then 2nd right, then the big pressure door at the end. You will be able to see the ships. Find the smallest one with the Concord registration. The override code for that class of ship is always the hull serial number reversed. Go." Saravel looked at him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to go back," Cole said. The group went very still. "Back," Saravel repeated, and something in her chest clenched hard. There are 6 of them. 6 trained Vrethkai hunters. You are one person with no weapon." "Yes," Cole said. "Then you will be killed," she said, and she reached out and put her hand on his arm, firm and certain, the way she had been trained to speak to people in crisis situations. "Stop. I am ordering you to stop. We will find another way through." Cole looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face, and she saw something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Not coldness, and not cruelty. Something quieter and older than either of those things, like a door that had been standing closed for a long time and had no reason to open. "Princess," he said, and his voice was even and calm. "I know there are 6. I have been counting them since I heard the first pair of boots in the East Corridor 20 minutes ago. I was waiting to see if more would join." He looked at her hand on his arm again, and he gently moved it aside. Not unkindly, "Keep going," he said to the group. "Do not stop, and do not look back." And then he turned and walked back into the dark corridor behind them, unhurried, quiet, his footsteps barely making a sound. And within 4 steps, the dark had swallowed him completely, as if he had never been standing there at all. Saravel stood frozen for 3 full seconds. Uskra put a hand on her shoulder from behind. His voice was very low. "Move!" "A princess," he said. And there was something in his voice she had never heard from a Vrethkai soldier before. And something with no name, but with a very clear shape. It was the sound of an old and experienced creature that had just recognized something it did not want to be near. "Move now, and do not go back for him." She moved. Behind them, the dark corridor was completely silent. The 6 hunters were already in it. Commander Vethskar had been hunting things for 31 years. He had tracked prey across frozen moons and burning deserts and through the pressurized jungle corridors of colony ships. He had hunted creatures twice his size and creatures that could turn invisible in open light. He had never once, in 31 years, failed to bring back what he was sent after 6 hunters, his 6 best, and 1 unarmed, unarmored, flat-clawed human with no natural weapons. He had told Grathvel this would take under 10 minutes. He had said it with complete confidence because why would he not? The 6 hunters entered the maintenance corridor in 2 groups of 3, spread wide. So moving low and fast, the way trained Vrethkai always moved through enclosed spaces, quiet, controlled, covering the angles, their thermal vision active, scanning the corridor ahead for the heat signature of a soft-skinned creature that would glow like a lamp in the dark. The corridor was empty, that was expected. The human had a head start, maybe 3 minutes, nothing to worry about. The 2 groups pushed forward, moving deeper into the maintenance section, and Vethskar stayed at the corridor entrance, coordinating through the short-range comm units each hunter carried on a clip behind their left ear. 1 minute in, the first pair of hunters reported contact. Thermal signature spotted, moving away fast, ducking into a side passage near the power conduit block. "Cut it off from the left," Vethskar said. "Zakro, take your pair wide and come in from the ventilation junction. Box it in." "Moving," Zakro replied. 30 seconds of silence. Then Zakro's comm clicked open, and Vethskar heard breathing, fast and uneven. The kind of breathing Zakro never did. Zakro was the steadiest soldier in the entire unit, and he had the lung control of someone who had been trained to hold completely still for hours. Fast. The uneven breathing was not a thing Zakro did. "Zakro," Vethskar said. "Report." A pause, longer than it should have been. "I cannot find where it went," Zakro said, and his voice was carefully flat in the way a voice gets when something has rattled a person and they do not want anyone to know. "It was here. I saw the heat trace. It went into the vent crawl space above Junction 7, and then the trace just stopped. It is not in the vent. It is not in the corridor. I cannot find it." "Heat suppression," said one of the other hunters over the comm, meaning some kind of cooling technology, a thermal suit, something to mask a body's heat. It is a soft skin in a prison uniform, Zakro said flatly. It has no suit. Vethskar frowned but kept his voice level. Spread out. It is in that section somewhere. It cannot have gone far. Find it and end this. 2 minutes passed. Then Hunter Drev, on the south side of the maintenance block, made a noise over the comm that was not a word. It was just a sound, short and sharp, the kind of sound a trained soldier makes when something happens very fast and very unexpectedly. And then his comm went silent. Drev, Vethskar said. Drev, report. Nothing. Someone go to Drev's position, south access near the coolant line junction. 30 seconds later, and one of the other hunters found Drev, and what she said over the comm was brief and very quiet. He is down. He is breathing, but he is down, and his comm is gone. Vethskar stood at the corridor entrance and felt the first small, cold finger of something he was not accustomed to feeling press against the back of his mind. The human had taken Drev's comm, not run, not kept moving toward the docking bay, taken the comm off a downed hunter and kept it. Why would it take the comm? Oh, unless it wanted to listen. Vethskar looked at the comm unit clipped behind his own ear and said nothing for a long moment. And in the silence of that moment, he thought very carefully about what kind of creature takes a communication device off a downed opponent in the middle of a dark corridor while 5 more hunters are actively searching for it. Prey did not do that. Prey ran. The cold finger pressed a little harder. Everyone, he said carefully into the comm. Change to secondary. Channel. Now. Do not use primary channel anymore. He switched channels. 3 hunters responded, which meant 2 were not responding, which meant 2 were down. 2 down in under 4 minutes, with no sound, no alarm, no distress call. Just silence where soldiers used to be. Vethskar moved into the corridor himself now. He told himself it was to command more effectively. But the honest part of his brain knew it was because standing at the entrance while his hunters went silent one at a time was beginning to feel like the wrong place to be. The maintenance section was dark. The light panels here were old, and many had failed entirely. Visibility was down to a few meters in most directions, and the corridor layout was a maze of branching passages, access hatches, conduit pipes, and low-hanging cable bundles that broke up lines of sight every few steps. In this kind of space, thermal vision was supposed to be an overwhelming advantage. Vethskar's thermal vision was showing him empty corridors, but his hunters kept going down. He stopped at a junction and held still and listened. And that was when he noticed the noises. Small sounds, irregular, coming from different directions every time. A scrape of boot on metal from the left, a soft clang from above, and something that might have been a breath from behind a pipe cluster to the right, never the same place twice, never close enough to pin down, never stopping long enough to localize. The human was moving. Not running, moving, shifting position in the dark, never staying in one place. Never predictable. And it was doing it quietly enough that a trained Vrethkai hunter with thermal vision and 30 years of experience was standing in a corridor listening to it and could not tell where it was, Vethskar realized. With a cold and creeping certainty that settled into his chest like ice water, that the sounds were not the human trying to escape him. The sounds were the human choosing where it wanted to be next. There was a difference. A very large difference between something moving in the dark because it was afraid and trying to get away, and something moving in the dark because it was choosing its positions. And the difference lived entirely in the pattern. And the pattern here had no fear in it at all. It had purpose. One more hunter went silent. Then another Vethskar stood at the junction with 1 hunter left, out of 6. And he did not move, and he did not speak into the comm. And he breathed very carefully and quietly. because somewhere in the dark of this corridor a creature with no armor and no claws and no natural weapons was repositioning. And it had not been running away from anything this entire time. It had been running toward something, and that something was them. He finally understood what Uskra had tried to tell Grathvel on the first day when they brought the human aboard. It was not prey. It had never been prey. It had been standing in the cage with them from the very beginning, looking at them, counting them, learning them. And they had called it soft and laughed at its flat claws and sent it to the pit. And it had let them do all of that, quietly and patiently, without a single reaction, because it was not afraid of them. It was waiting for the right moment to stop pretending to be the smaller thing in the room. Veth Skar opened his mouth to say something into the comm. A sound, very close. From directly behind him, he spun around. The corridor was empty, and then the last hunter's comm went silent too. The docking bay of Veth. Kalos was a large, cold room, high ceiling, dim light, had the smell of engine fuel thick in the recycled air. Rows of ships sat in their berths along the walls, ranging from small one-person runners to mid-sized cargo haulers with their loading ramps still down Saravel, and the group had made it. They stood near the far end of the bay, moving quickly toward the conquered registered ship Cole had told them to find. The Lethian negotiator was already at the access panel, hands shaking slightly. They're punching in the reversed hull serial number. The others were watching the bay entrance, tight-shouldered and quiet. Then the entrance doors opened. Grathvel walked in. He was not alone. He had 12 soldiers with him, and they spread across the bay entrance in a wide line, cutting off the exit. Grathvel himself walked forward slowly, his heavy footsteps ringing against the floor plates. And he looked at the group of escaped prisoners with an expression that had moved well past irritation into something flat and final. "You made it further than I expected," he said, and his voice had no humor in it now. "But this is where it ends. Come away from the ship, all of you, and we will decide what to do with you back in the cells." Saravel stood her ground. She was Ethon royalty, and she had been trained since childhood to stand in front of powerful and dangerous things without letting her legs do what they wanted to do, which was run. And she stood straight and met Grathvel's yellow eyes and said nothing. Grathvel tilted his head. "Where is the human?" He said nobody answered. Grathvel looked at the soldiers behind the group. None of them had eyes on Cole. He looked at the bay entrance behind him and then back at the prisoners. And for just a moment, one brief and very small moment, something moved across his face. Not quite fear. And because Grathvel did not do fear, but a cousin of it. A flicker of uncertainty in a face that was not built for uncertainty. Then the door to the bay opened again. Not the main entrance, a side service door set into the wall to the right. And Cole walked in. He was unhurried. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow, thin, already drying, and his gray uniform had a dark stain on the left sleeve. That was everything. No limp, no labored breathing, no wild eyes. He walked into the bay the way someone walks into a room they had already been in once today, and had no particular feelings about returning to. He stopped about 10 meters from Grathvel. Grathvel looked at him, then looked at the empty doorway behind him, and his jaw tightened. 6 hunters, Grathvel said. "Yes," Cole said, "my 6 best hunters." "I know," Cole said. "I watched them work in the corridors on the second day when they ran a sweep of the lower block. I needed to understand how they moved before tonight." The 12 soldiers at the bay entrance shifted, not moving forward yet, but adjusting their weight, exchanging looks with each other in that small, sideways way that soldiers do when something is making them uneasy and they do not want the person next to them to know it. Grathvel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, slowly and with great care, like someone choosing every word before placing it down, "What are you?" Cole did not answer immediately. He looked at Saravel first, and she saw that expression again, the one from the corridor, the quiet and old enclosed thing. But this time it was softer around the edges. And then what she found underneath it when she looked carefully was not coldness. It was something tired. The tiredness of a thing that carries something heavy all the time and has learned to carry it so well that it barely shows. Then he looked at Grathvel and he answered, "We are not the biggest," Cole said. "We are not the strongest or the fastest. There are species in this galaxy with thicker hide, sharper teeth, better eyes. We do not have any of that." He paused, not for effect. Just because the next part took a moment to find the right words for 100,000 years ago, before we had metal or fire or anything you would call a weapon. We lived on a world that was full of things that were bigger than us, and faster than us, and stronger than us. And we survived anyway, not because we could outfight them or outrun them, but because we could do something none of them could do. He looked at Grathvel steadily. "We could follow them forever," Cole said. "We are persistence hunters. We cannot catch our prey in a sprint. So we do not sprint. We walk. We walk and we walk and we do not stop, not for hours. Not for the whole day if we have to. And the animal runs, and it gets hot and it gets tired and its muscles stop working the way they should. And we are still walking, steady, us behind it. And eventually the animal stops because its body will not let it go anymore. And we are still there, still coming, still walking toward it. And that is how we ate. That is how we survived. That is what we were built to do." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "That instinct never left us," he said. "Every human alive carries it. That thing that does not know how to stop following. That thing that does not feel what most creatures feel when they are outnumbered in the dark. Most creatures feel fear. We feel something else. We feel like we are home." Saravel felt that cold thing move through her chest again. But this time she had a name for it. She had been wrong about what Cole was from the very first moment she saw him standing in the ship corridor looking at the floor. She had thought he was quiet because he was frightened. She had thought the stillness was shock. She had thought she needed to protect him. He had not been frightened. He had been so patient. He had been doing exactly what his species had been doing for 100,000 years, watching, waiting, learning the shape of the thing in front of him before he decided to follow it into the dark. Grathvel stood very still for a long moment. And then he made the decision that defined him, because Grathvel was a warlord, and warlords do not step back, and the 12 soldiers behind him were watching. And so he raised his hand and pointed at Cole and said, "Kill it!" and charged forward himself. Cole moved. What happened next was shorter than the fight in the pit on the first day, and when it was done, Grathvel was on the floor, and the 12 soldiers were standing very still, and Cole was standing in the middle of the bay, breathing normally, looking at them one by one in that steady, reading way, and not one of the 12 soldiers moved. Nobody spoke. Cole turned and walked toward the Concorde ship. "Get on board," he said to the group, in the same flat and informational tone he always used. "We are leaving now." Nobody argued. The Concorde-registered ship cleared the docking bay of Veth Kalos without being fired upon. Nobody chased them. The 12 soldiers in the bay had stood completely still while the ship powered up and the loading ramp closed, and the engines pushed it backward out of its berth and through the bay doors. And not one of them moved to the weapons controls or raised a hand or said a word into a comm. They just stood in the bay, and watched it go. And the reason for that was simple and had nothing to do with mercy or strategy, and everything to do with the fact that Cole had stood in the center of that bay and looked at each of them in turn before walking away, and none of them had any desire at all to remind him they were still in the room. The ship made the jump to transit speed 3 minutes after clearing the station. In the small rear cabin, the group sat in whatever spaces they could find, some on the floor, some on the narrow bench that ran along one wall, and nobody spoke for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone was doing the quiet work of processing things that did not have easy shapes. Yet Cole sat near the back bulkhead, not with the group, a little apart, his forearms resting on his knees, his eyes on the floor, the same posture he had stood in at the ship corridor when they were first captured. When the Vrethkai soldier had grabbed his arm and examined his claws and laughed, he had not changed. That was the thing that stayed with Saravel as she sat across the cabin and looked at him. He was exactly the same as he had been in the very first moment she saw him. The same quiet, the same stillness, and the same unremarkable face. And the only difference was that now she was looking at him correctly, and the quiet looked completely different when you looked at it correctly. She got up and crossed the cabin and sat down near him. He looked up. "I want to apologize," she said. Cole looked at her without expression, waiting. "I thought you needed protecting," she said. "From the very first day, I thought you were the one who was most in danger. I kept looking at you and seeing something small and invulnerable, and I wanted to put myself between you and what was coming for you." Cole said nothing. "I was wrong," she said. "Not just a little wrong, completely wrong in a way that says more about my ignorance than anything else. And I am sorry for it." Cole was quiet for a moment, and then he said in the same flat, unhurried way he said everything. "You were not wrong to care. You thought a person was in danger and you tried to help them. That is not something to apologize for." "I ordered you to stop," she said. "When you turned back in that corridor, I grabbed your arm and told you to stop. And if you had listened to me, we would all still be in that station." "Yes," Cole agreed, without judgment. "I just confirming a fact. Why did you not listen?" she asked. Cole looked at the floor for a moment, thinking, which was something he did quietly and thoroughly before speaking, she had noticed. And then he said, "Because I could hear them, 6 of them, moving into position in the corridor behind us. And I knew what that section of the station looked like. I had been mapping it for 3 days. And I knew that if we all kept going together, and they would catch us before the docking bay, the corridor pinches down to a single-width passage about 60 meters from the bay entrance. 6 hunters. Single-file passage. That is not a situation you talk your way out of, and it is not one you run through." He paused. "The only way through it was to make sure those 6 hunters never reached that passage," he said. "So I went back, because I was the only one who could." Saravel absorbed that. "You could have told us that," she said. "You could have explained it in the corridor." "Yes," Cole said, "but explaining takes time. And time was the one thing we did not have, and the outcome was the same either way. I could explain it to you now, or I could go back then. I went back then." She thought about that for a long moment. And then she nodded slowly, because it was exactly the kind of thinking she should have expected from him. Efficient, clear, unsentimental, and correct. When they reached conquered space 2 days later, Saravel sat in the small forward cabin with the ship's basic terminal and began writing her incident report, which was a required procedure after any diplomatic emergency, and which she intended to file completely and honestly with no omissions. She wrote carefully, and she wrote everything. The ambush, the capture, the station, the pit fights, the escape, the corridor, the docking bay. She wrote it all in precise diplomatic language, the way she had been trained, and with clear facts and careful wording. When she reached the section about Warrant Officer Darren Cole's conduct, she stopped. She sat with her hands above the keyboard for a while, not because she did not know what to write, but because she was making sure she had the right words, the words that were true and exact, and that would not be easy to dismiss or reduce to something smaller than what they meant. Then she wrote, "For the duration of this incident, I operated under the consistent assumption that Warrant Officer Cole required protection and that my role was, at least in part, to provide it. I was incorrect in this assumption, and I was incorrect from the very beginning. Warrant Officer Cole did not require protection at any point during the incident. He required time. Time to observe, time to map, time to understand the full shape of the situation before he acted. And once he had that time, every decision he made was precise, correct, and executed without hesitation. I was not assigned an escort. I was assigned a warning. A warning written in the quiet behavior of a species that spent more than 100,000 years learning how to survive by outthinking and outlasting everything on a world full of things that were physically superior to them. A warning I was too uninformed about human history and human biology to read. I will not make that mistake again. I recommend that the Galactic Concord immediately commission a full and unrestricted review of all existing assessments of humanity, their history, their evolution, their psychological profile, and their current role in Concord affairs, not because humans are a threat to be contained, and not because they are simply an ally to be equipped and pointed at problems, but because every assessment currently on record was written by people who looked at humans the same way the Vrethkai soldiers looked at Warrant Officer Cole in that corridor. They saw soft skin and flat claws and no natural armor, and they made a decision about what they were looking at. And they were wrong in exactly the way that I was wrong, and in exactly the way that 6 of the Vrethkai's best hunters were wrong, and wrong in the way that eventually costs something humanity has been patient with our assumptions, patient with our condescension, as patient with the comfortable story we have all been telling ourselves about what they are and where they belong in the order of things. They have been patient for a long time, and they have never corrected us. Because they did not need to. Because they were watching and waiting, and then learning the shape of everything around them, the same way they always have. And I think we should all take a very careful moment to consider what that means. The report was filed the same day they reached Concord space. 3 weeks later, it was read aloud in the full Concord chamber, as part of a standard diplomatic review session. The reading was routine procedure. One and the delegates present had no particular expectations for it beyond a dull administrative half-hour before the real agenda items. The chamber went quiet about halfway through the reading and stayed quiet until the last line. Then it stayed quiet for a little longer than that. The Vrethkai ambassador, seated in the 3rd row on the east side of the chamber, was very still, and the delegate beside him noticed that the ambassador had both hands pressed flat against the desk in front of him. In the way someone grips something solid when they feel the floor shifting under them, nobody said anything for a long time. Cole, at that moment, was already somewhere in the outer reaches on a new assignment. The file listed his current status in 3 plain words: active, in transit. There was no destination listed and no contact window provided, and no estimated return date, and the section for additional notes had been left completely blank, which told anyone who read it exactly as much as it was intended to tell them, and nothing more.